The rope was already around her neck when the drunk cowboy stumbled into town. Marlo Thorne stood on the wooden platform in the center of Bitter Creek's main square, her hands bound behind her back, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. The noose scratched against her pale skin as Judge Harrison Blackwood read her death sentence to the gathered crowd of maybe 40 souls. She was 23 years old, a seamstress, an orphan, and in 10 minutes she'd be dead for a crime she didn't commit. The judge's voice boomed across the square as he declared her guilty of stealing his wife's emerald necklace, a piece worth more than most folks in Bitter Creek would see in a lifetime. Marlo had been working late in Mrs. Blackwood's parlor hemming a dress when the necklace went missing. She was the only one there, the only suspect, but Marlo knew the truth. She'd seen Mrs. Blackwood hide that necklace herself, watched through the window as the judge's wife buried it in the garden behind their house. The woman had set her up, but who would believe the word of a poor orphan girl against the judge's wife? The crowd murmured with a mix of excitement and unease. Some folks looked away. Others stared with morbid curiosity. Children pressed their faces against storefront windows. This was Bitter Creek's first public hanging in 3 years, and Judge Blackwood was making it a spectacle. Marlo's knees buckled slightly as the executioner, a thin man named Garrett Walsh, tested the trapdoor mechanism beneath her feet. The wood creaked ominously. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat, competing with the rope for space. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. How could God let this happen? She'd never heard anyone, never taken so much as a penny that wasn't hers. She'd worked 16-hour days since she was 14, sewing and mending clothes for the town's families, barely scraping together enough money for a room above Muller's general store. Judge Blackwood pulled out his pocket watch. His cold gray eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw something there that made her stomach turn. Satisfaction. He was enjoying this. The judge snapped his watch shut and nodded to the executioner. Garrett's hand moved toward the lever that would drop the trapdoor. That's when they heard the sound of spurs clanking against wooden steps, slow and deliberate, coming up behind the platform. But the drunk cowboy climbing those steps was about to change everything, and what he was carrying in his saddlebag would turn this execution into something nobody in Bitter Creek would ever forget. Caleb Iron Creek, McKenzie Ryer of whiskey, and 3 days on a trail. His boots hit each step with the unsteady rhythm of a man who'd spent the better part of the morning in a saloon 2 towns over. His weathered black hat sat crooked on his head, and his brown duster was covered in dust and questionable stains. To everyone watching, he looked like just another drifter who'd wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. But Caleb's eyes, bloodshot though they were, took in everything with sharp precision. The positioning of the town's men, the way Judge Blackwood's hand rested on his gun, the terror in the young woman's face, and most importantly, the way the crowd seemed more afraid than excited. He'd seen enough hangings to know when something was wrong. Judge Blackwood turned toward the interruption, his face flushing red with irritation. He was a big man, well-fed and well-dressed with silver hair and the kind of authority that came from years of making life and death decisions without question. "This is a legal proceeding," Blackwood barked. "Move along, cowboy, before I have you arrested for disturbing the peace." Caleb swayed slightly but didn't back down. His voice came out slurred, but loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "Legal? You call this legal?" He gestured broadly at Marlo, nearly losing his balance in the process. "You're about to hang a girl who looks like she ain't never heard of fly. What exactly did this little thing do? Murder the whole town?" The crowd shifted nervously. A few people exchanged glances. Caleb might be drunk, but he was asking the question some of them had been thinking. Judge Blackwood's jaw tightened. "She's a thief. Stole valuable property from my wife. The law is clear about such matters." "Your wife?" Caleb let out a bitter laugh that echoed across the square. "Well, ain't that convenient? Judge, jury, and victim all in the same household." Marlo stared at this stranger in disbelief. Nobody had spoken up for her during the trial. Not one person had questioned the judge's version of events. But this drunk cowboy, this complete stranger, was willing to challenge the most powerful man in Bitter Creek. Judge Blackwood stepped closer to Caleb, his hand moving to rest on his gun handle. "I suggest you move along before you join her on that platform." But Caleb wasn't backing down. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something that made several people in the crowd gasp. It was a badge, tarnished and dented, but unmistakably real, and the look that crossed Judge Blackwood's face in that moment told everyone present that this hanging was about to become something much more complicated. Deputy U.S. Marshal. The words were barely visible on the worn metal, but they were there. The crowd fell silent. Even the children stopped fidgeting in the windows. Judge Blackwood's face went from red to pale in the span of a heartbeat. His hand, which had been resting confidently on his gun, now trembled slightly. Caleb tucked the badge back into his coat, but the damage was done. "Now then, Judge," he said, his words still slurred but carrying new weight, "you were saying something about the law being clear." Marlo felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. A federal marshal here now. Maybe God hadn't abandoned her after all. But Judge Blackwood recovered quickly. Years of corruption had taught him how to handle unexpected threats. Marshal or not, you have no jurisdiction here. This is a local matter tried in a local court according to local law. "Local law," Caleb repeated, swaying as he considered the words. "Tell me about this trial. Judge, how long did it last? Who represented the girl? What evidence did you present?" The questions hung in the air like smoke. Judge Blackwood's jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered. She was caught red-handed. My wife's necklace was missing, and she was the only one in the house. Red-handed? Caleb's voice got louder. "You mean you found the necklace on her in her possession?" "Well, no, but nothing." Caleb took a step closer to the platform, and though he still swayed with drink, there was something dangerous in his movement. "You're telling me you're about to hang this girl because a necklace went missing while she was in the house?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Patterson, the school teacher, whispered something to her husband. Old Tom Fletcher removed his hat and scratched his head. Even Sheriff Wade Morrison, who'd been standing silently beside the platform, shifted uncomfortably. Judge Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "The evidence is clear enough for me." "Evidence?" Caleb laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've seen more evidence at a church picnic pie contest." "Where's the necklace now, Judge? Did you search her room, question other witnesses, or did you just decide she was guilty because It was convenient. Marlo watched this exchange with growing amazement. Every question Caleb asked was one her court-appointed lawyer should have raised. But lawyer Hiram Wells had spent all of 10 minutes on her case, asking no questions and presenting no defense. Judge Blackwood was losing control of the situation, and everyone could see it. His authority, which had gone unquestioned for years, was crumbling in front of the entire town. "Marshal," he said through gritted teeth, "I don't care what badge you carry. This girl is guilty, and she will hang." But Caleb was reaching into his saddlebag now, and what he pulled out made Judge Blackwood take an involuntary step backward, because it wasn't just evidence that would save Marlo Thorne. It was proof that would destroy everything Judge Blackwood had built in Bitter Creek. The emerald necklace caught the afternoon sunlight like green fire. Caleb held it high above his head so everyone in the square could see it clearly. The intricate gold chain, the perfect emerald stones, the distinctive clasp that Mrs. Blackwood had described in such detail during the trial. It was unmistakably the same piece of jewelry that Marlo had supposedly stolen. "Found this buried in the garden behind the judge's house about an hour ago," Caleb announced, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "Funny place for a stolen necklace to end up, don't you think?" Judge Blackwood's face went white. "That's impossible. You're lying." "Am I?" Caleb's bloodshot eyes fixed on the judge with laser focus. "Your wife told the whole town that this necklace was stolen from her jewelry box while Miss Thorne was working in your parlor. But here it is, buried in your own backyard, wrapped in this." He pulled out a piece of fabric, expensive silk, unmistakably from a woman's dress. Several women in the crowd recognized the pattern immediately. It was from one of Mrs. Blackwood's finest gowns. Marlo felt her knees go weak with relief. She'd been right. She'd seen Mrs. Blackwood bury something that night. But when she'd tried to tell Lawyer Wells, he'd dismissed her claims as desperate lies. The crowd was buzzing now, voices rising in confusion and anger. Tom Fletcher stepped forward, his weathered face creased with disgust. "Judge, what's the meaning of this?" But Judge Blackwood wasn't backing down. "This man is clearly working with the girl. He planted that evidence to save his accomplice." "His accomplice?" Caleb laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Judge, I rode into this town 20 minutes ago. I've never seen this girl before in my life, but I've seen plenty of corrupt officials, and you smell like one from 3 counties away." Sheriff Morrison finally found his voice. "Judge, if the necklace was in your garden, it wasn't in my garden," Blackwood snapped. "This drunken fool is lying." But Mrs. Patterson was speaking up now, her school-teacher voice clear and firm. "I saw Marlo that night, Judge. She came to my house after she finished work crying and scared. She told me she'd seen something strange, but was afraid to say what." "She told me the same thing," added Samuel Muller, the store owner, "said she'd witnessed something that could get her in trouble." The crowd was turning. Judge Blackwood could feel his control slipping away like sand through his fingers. Years of absolute authority, of making decisions without question, were crumbling in front of his eyes. "None of this matters," he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "The trial is over. The sentence has been passed." But Caleb was walking up the steps to the platform now, moving with sudden steadiness that suggested his drunkenness might not have been as complete as it appeared. He reached Marlo and began working at the ropes around her wrists. "Step away from the prisoner." Judge Blackwood drew his gun, pointing it directly at Caleb's chest. The entire square went dead silent. Even the children stopped moving in the windows. That's when Caleb spoke the words that would change everything in Bitter Creek forever and revealed the real reason he'd come to this forgotten town in the middle of nowhere. "I came here for you, Harrison Blackwood." Caleb's voice was stone-cold sober now, all traces of slurred speech gone. He turned to face the judge, ignoring the gun pointed at his chest. 3 years I've been tracking you. 3 years since you disappeared from Carson City with $50,000 in territorial funds. The crowd gasped collectively. Judge Blackwood's face went from pale to ashen. "You're insane. I've been serving this community for 5 years. 5 years under a stolen name?" Caleb continued, his hand moving slowly toward his own gun. "Your real name is Henry Blackstone. You were territorial treasurer in Nevada until you embezzled government money and fled west." Marlo stared in shock as this drama unfolded around her. The news still hung around her neck, but suddenly her execution seemed like the least important thing happening in the square. Mrs. Patterson spoke up again, her voice shaking. "Is this true? Have we been living under the authority of a criminal?" Judge Blackwood's gun hand was trembling now. "Lies, all lies. This drunk is desperate to save his girl." "My girl?" Caleb smiled grimly. "I told you I never saw her before today. But when I rode into town and saw you about to hang an innocent person to cover up your wife's theft, well, that just made my job easier. The pieces were falling into place for everyone watching. Mrs. Blackwood had stolen her own necklace and blamed Marlo to create a distraction. Judge Blackwood had rushed through a sham trial to get rid of the only witness, but they hadn't counted on a federal marshal tracking the judge down at the worst possible moment. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his hand on his own weapon. "Judge, you need to put that gun down and answer these accusations. I am the law in this town." Blackwood screamed, "I decide who lives and dies." But the crowd was surrounding the platform now. Tom Fletcher, Samuel Muller, Mrs. Patterson, and a dozen others were climbing the steps. Judge Blackwood was outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. If you were Caleb McKenzie, what would you do? Try to talk the desperate judge down and risk him shooting innocent people, or draw your gun and end this standoff with violence? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Caleb decided next would determine whether Marlo Thorne lived to see another sunset. The marshal's hand hovered over his gun handle, his eyes locked on Judge Blackwood's finger on the trigger. One wrong move from either man would turn this rescue into a massacre. And in that moment of deadly silence, Mrs. Blackwood herself appeared at the edge of the square. She was running toward the platform, screaming something that would shatter her husband's last hope of escape and reveal the final, most shocking truth about what had really happened in Bitter Creek. "Harrison, stop. She knows about Rebecca." Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut through the tension like a knife. She was running across the square in her expensive blue dress, her carefully arranged hair coming undone, her face strewn with tears. Judge Blackwood's gun wavered. "Elizabeth, get back to the house." But she kept coming, gasping for breath. As she reached the platform, she saw the letters Harrison, The girl saw Rebecca's letters. The name hit Judge Blackwood like a physical blow. His face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like an old man instead of a threatening authority figure. Caleb seized the moment. "Who's Rebecca Judge?" Mrs. Blackwood climbed the platform steps, sobbing openly. "Now, she was Harrison's first wife in Carson City. He told everyone here that he was a widower, but Rebecca is still alive." The crowd murmured in shock. Bigamy was a serious crime, but more than that, it meant everything Judge Blackwood had told him about his past was a lie. Marlo found her voice for the first time since this ordeal began. "I did see letters," she whispered, then spoke louder. "When I was working in your parlor, Mrs. Blackwood, I saw you reading letters signed your loving wife, Rebecca. You saw me looking and got scared." Mrs. Blackwood nodded miserably. "I knew she'd figure it out eventually. Harrison convinced me to frame her for theft, too, to get rid of the problem." Judge Blackwood's gun dropped to his side. The weight of his lies was finally crushing him. "Elizabeth, please." "No," she screamed. "I won't let you hang an innocent girl to protect your secrets. I already helped you steal from the territory. I already helped you build a new life on lies, but I won't help you commit murder." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward and gently took the gun from Judge Blackwood's unresisting hand. The fight had gone out of him completely. Caleb quickly removed the noose from Marlo's neck and cut her bonds. She collapsed to her knees, gasping and crying, finally free after days of terror. "Thank you," she whispered to Caleb. "How did you know to look in the garden?" Caleb helped her to her feet. "I didn't. But when I saw Mrs. Blackwood watching the hanging from her window, wringing her hands like she was guilty of something, I figured she might have buried evidence. Lucky guess." The crowd was dispersing now, people talking in hushed, angry voices about the corruption that had ruled their town. Sheriff Morrison was placing both Blackwoods under arrest, though Mrs. Blackwood was cooperating fully. Tom Fletcher approached the platform. "Marshal, what happens now?" Caleb looked around at the faces of the town's people, honest folks who'd been deceived and manipulated by a criminal who'd hidden behind a judge's robes. Now you elect a new judge, a real one this time, and you make sure something like this never happens again. But as the immediate crisis ended, Caleb realized his job was far from over, because Judge Blackwood had been running more than just a corrupt court, and what they were about to discover in his house would reveal a criminal operation that reached far beyond the borders of Bitter Creek. The strong box under Judge Blackwood's bed contained enough evidence to hang a dozen men. Caleb and Sheriff Morrison searched the house while the Blackwood sat in jail cells. What they found was a carefully documented criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. Forged land deeds, stolen cattle brands, falsified court records, and correspondence with outlaws across 3 territories. But it was the leather journal hidden behind the false bottom that made Caleb's blood run cold. "Morrison, look at this," he called, his voice tight with anger. The sheriff peered over Caleb's shoulder as the marshal read from the judge's handwriting. Entry after entry, detailed bribes taken, verdicts bought, and innocent people railroaded into prison or worse. The Marlo Thorne case wasn't an aberration. It was business as usual. "Sweet Mary," Morrison whispered, "how many people has he condemned?" Caleb flipped through page after page. "At least 30 cases I can see here. Probably more." He stopped at one entry that made his jaw clench. Here, 2 years ago, a Mexican family accused of cattle rustling hanged the father and oldest son, sold the mother and children into indentured servitude. Morrison's face went pale. The Hernandez family. I remember that case. Always thought something was off about it. Meanwhile, across town, Marlo sat in Samuel Muller's store, still wearing the same dress she'd nearly died in, trying to process everything that had happened. Mrs. Muller had brought her soup and coffee, but her hands shook too much to hold the cup steady. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Marlo said quietly, "that I'll still be in that cell waiting to die." Mrs. Muller patted her hand gently. "You're safe now, dear. That monster can't hurt you any more." But Marlo's relief was mixed with a growing anger. How many other people weren't as lucky as me? How many innocent folks died because of his lies? The question haunted everyone in Bitter Creek. The town they thought they knew had been built on corruption and murder. Judge Blackwood hadn't just been stealing money. He'd been stealing lives. When Caleb returned from the search, he found Marlo sitting on the store's front porch, staring out at the square where she'd almost died. The hanging platform still stood there, a grim reminder of how close she'd come to becoming another victim. "Miss Thorne," he said, removing his hat, "I wanted to apologize." She looked up at him with confusion. "Apologize? You saved my life. I should have been here sooner, should have caught him before he hurt so many people." Caleb's voice was heavy with guilt. "I've been tracking him for 3 years, and in that time you can't save everyone," Marlo said softly. "But you saved me, and now you can save the others he's still hurting." Caleb nodded, but the weight of those lost lives would stay with him forever. As the sun began to set over Bitter Creek, the town faced an uncertain future, but for the first time in years, it was a future built on truth instead of lies. 3 hours later, Judge Harrison Blackwood confessed to everything. Faced with overwhelming evidence and his wife's complete cooperation, he broke down completely in his jail cell. Sheriff Morrison wrote down every word as Blackwood detailed years of corruption, theft, and murder. The federal authorities would need every confession to undo the damage he'd done. Caleb stood outside the jail as the sun set, smoking a cigarette and watching the townspeople gather in small groups, talking quietly about their uncertain future. Tom Fletcher approached him with several other men. "Marshal," Fletcher said, "we want to thank you proper. If you hadn't shown up when you did, just doing my job," Caleb replied. But he shook each man's hand firmly. "What happens to the town now?" asked Samuel Muller. "Half our legal decisions for the past 5 years were made by a criminal. You'll get a new judge appointed by the territorial governor, real one this time, and there'll be a commission to review every case Blackwood handled." Caleb dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "It'll take time, but justice will be done." Marlo emerged from Mrs. Muller's store carrying a small bundle of her few possessions. She decided to leave Bitter Creek. Too many bad memories haunted every corner of the town. "Where will you go?" Caleb asked her. "San Francisco, maybe, or Denver. Somewhere I can start fresh." She looked at him with genuine gratitude. "I'll never forget what you did for me, Marshal McKenzie." "Caleb," he corrected, "and I hope your new life is everything you deserve." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "What about you? Back to tracking criminals?" Caleb looked back at the jail where the Blackwood sat awaiting transport to federal prison. "Actually, I think I might stay here for a while, help the new judge sort through this mess, make sure the people who were wronged get some justice." As the evening stars appeared overhead, Sheriff Morrison joined them on the street. "Got word from the territorial capital. They're sending a prosecutor next week to start reviewing cases. Could take months to sort through everything." "Good." Caleb said the families of those innocent people deserve answers. Mrs. Blackwood would face charges, but would likely receive a reduced sentence for her cooperation. Judge Blackwood would spend the rest of his life in federal prison if he was lucky enough to avoid the hangman's noose for his murders. The corrupt empire he'd built in Bitter Creek was finished. Epilogue. 6 months later, Marlo Thorne opened her own seamstress shop in Denver, where she became known for her kindness to other young women in need. She never married, but she lived a long, peaceful life surrounded by friends who valued her gentle spirit. Caleb McKenzie remained in Bitter Creek for 2 years, helping to rebuild the town's legal system. Eventually, he was appointed territorial marshal for the entire region, continuing his work to root out corruption wherever he found it. Sheriff Morrison became the interim judge until a permanent replacement arrived, proving himself to be fair and honest in every decision he made. And the hanging platform in Bitter Creek's town square was torn down the very next day. Its wood burned in a bonfire that could be seen for miles, a symbol that justice, not vengeance, would rule their town from that day forward. If you enjoyed this story of courage standing up to corruption, subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales from the Old West. And now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video.